Welcome to the Deep Dive, where we take a stack of information and, well, extract the most important nuggets of knowledge, helping you become well-informed quickly and thoroughly. Today, we're plunging into a truly fascinating and maybe even a bit provocative topic. It might just challenge how you think about innovation, about discovery itself, and maybe even how knowledge is truly formed in the world around us. We've got a fantastic set of sources at our disposal, mainly a discussion transcript from Nassim Taleb's big work, Antifragile, plus some related insights from various historians of science and technology. And these sources really get into the nitty-gritty of a core question. Does grand theory lead practice, or is it actually, the other way around?
Yeah, what's truly fascinating here is how deeply ingrained our usual assumption is. We typically picture this linear paths for progress, almost inevitable, right? Brilliant minds first develop these sophisticated theories, maybe scribbled on blackboards or tucked away in academic papers.
Right.
And then, only then, are those theories carefully applied to create new technologies, new advancements, new ways of doing things. But our sources suggest this might just be a widespread and, well, deeply misleading illusion. They call it an epiphenomenon.
And an epiphenomenon, so like something that happens alongside the real cause, but we mistake it for the cause.
Exactly. Or maybe we even get the cause and effect totally backward, like
Yeah.
thinking the rooster's crow makes the sun rise.
Okay, got it.
So, our mission today is to really unpack this powerful idea. We want to explore the surprising evidence, and there's quite a bit from a whole range of fields that suggests a very different reality. And ultimately, we want to uncover the true drivers behind some of the most significant leaps in human history. We'll be looking at, well, everything from the complex, high-stakes world of financial markets.
To the revolutionary development of jet engines, and even how those ancient cathedrals, the ones still standing today, were actually built. So, are you ready to challenge some, let's say, deeply ingrained assumptions about how the world really works? Okay, let's unpack this. Let's begin our journey into this counterintuitive idea with a very specific anecdote. It's almost legendary, really, and it brings the point home perfectly. It takes us back to 1998 into the high-stakes, fast-paced world of finance. The author of our source material recalls this really memorable lunch he had in a bustling Chicago restaurant. He was with a prominent chief economist, just referred to as Fred A.
Right, Fred A. And this economist, he was in the middle of advising various local exchanges on rolling out these complex new financial products, specifically exotic options.
Exotic options. Sounds complicated already.
They are. They're financial contracts with, let's say, more intricate payout structures than your standard options. Now, the economist's main worry, as he put it, was about the actual traders, the people who'd be handling these really sophisticated products. From his academic view, he saw them as largely uneducated, almost to the point where he thought they might confuse a complex mathematical theorem like the Karenoff theorem.
Uranoff theorem. Never heard of it.
Exactly. He thought they might mistake it for like a new brand of vodka.
Yeah.
His point was they couldn't possibly handle these products competently unless they had a deep theoretical grasp of this very specific, very complex mathematical idea. And back then, the Giranoff theorems deals with something called changes of measure in stochastic processes, very technical stuff. It was only really understood by a tiny, tiny group of highly specialized mathematical finance experts.
Okay, so the expert thinks the traders need this high-level math. But here's where the story takes that fascinating turn, right? This gets right to the core of our discussion. The author, who was a seasoned practitioner himself, years of experience as a pit trader, he had this immediate, almost jarring realization. He recognized, like a light bulb moment, that he had already, for years, figured out how to play with these complicated payoffs in the market. He was often dealing with the exact same exotic options the economist was worried about. And how did he do it? Not through formal education, not by studying theorems, through constant trial and error, learning by doing, basically. And, crucially, by picking the brains of experienced people, essentially, an informal apprenticeship with traders who'd actually survived and thrived in the market. And this entire practical skill set, he realized, had developed before he had ever even heard of theorems like Giranoff, let alone understood their math. It was just crystal clear. The sophisticated practice was already happening, way ahead of any formal theory.
That personal realization, it really clicks with a very simple, common sense observation, doesn't it? Think about a kid learning to ride a bike.
Yeah.
Nobody, not one parent or teacher, worries that the child who knows absolutely nothing about aerodynamics or gyroscopic stability or can't solve equations of motion, nobody thinks they'll be unable to ride the bike because of that.
Of course not. That would be absurd.
They just learn by doing. They wobble, they fall, they get back up, adjust their balance, pedal, and through that whole iterative embodied experience, they master it. The theory of cycling, if they ever learn it, comes much, much later, and it's pretty much irrelevant to actually riding.
It's absolutely true. You don't hand a kid a physics textbook and lecture them on fluid dynamics before they even try to pedal. The idea is just silly. So the question pops up naturally. Why then do we expect sophisticated financial traders navigating these intense, dynamic, real-world markets to need advanced mathematical theorems to set prices or manage risk? These traders are mostly responding to supply and demand, to market mood, to their own intuition. Kind of like a pistachios trader in a Damascus market, right? He doesn't need to solve general equilibrium equations to know the right price today.
Exactly. He relies on immediate feedback, observation, that accumulated practical wisdom. And the Force points this out, calls it a kind of blindness that can weirdly come from getting a PhD and focusing only on research in certain academic fields.
A strange loss of common sense, it says.
Yeah, suggesting that academic insulation can make you think knowledge must start with formal theory, and you just overlook the messy practical discovery process.
It really makes you wonder, doesn't it? Is there some kind of selection bias going on? Are people who maybe lack that practical street smart sense, are they more drawn to getting PhDs in what the author calls these fictional worlds of equation economics?
Where the neat models are more important than the messy reality?
Exactly. The author definitely smelled a rat here. He saw this need for someone who is both a practitioner and a researcher, someone whose practical experience came first and actually informed their academic work. And that conviction led him to team up with Eppenhog, this brilliant trader who'd independently seen the same thing happening.
That's right. And with that shared understanding, they jumped right into a systematic investigation. They wanted to trace the real ancestry, the source of option pricing models. Their basic question was simple, but wow, really impactful. What did people actually use before these famous academic formulas like Black-Scholes even existed?
Yeah, did the markets only start working properly after the formulas, or was it the other way around?
Precisely. Was it thanks to the academics?
Right.
Or did the formulas come much later, after this kind of anti-fragile evolutionary discovery process based on trial and error, learning and getting stronger from mistakes and volatility?
Only to be sort of expropriated by academics who then claimed they invented it.
That was the core question. And the author already had a strong hunch from his own time as a pit trader in Chicago. He'd seen these veteran traders, the ones who'd lasted decades in that brutal environment. They famously refused to touch mathematical formulas.
Not because they weren't smart, though.
No, not at all. They relied instead on what he called simple heuristics, these practical, experience-based rules of thumb for solving problems quickly. They'd even joke, with a bit of pride, real men don't use sheets.
Huh. Sheets, meaning the printouts from the complex computer formulas, right?
Exactly. Derisively referring to those printouts. Their knowledge was in their gut, in their hands, learned by doing, not reading manuals.
Okay, so they ditched the formulas, but did it work?
That's the crucial counterintuitive part that blows up the standard story. These traders, despite completely ignoring the formal math models, hadn't just survived in a market known for chewing people up. They often thrived. They made serious money, showed amazing resilience, and their heuristic-based prices, far from being simple, were often, get this, more sophisticated and more efficient than those produced by the formula.
Wow. More sophisticated how?
Well, for one thing, their practical, intuition-driven pricing somehow accounted for things like extremistan and the fat tail.
Okay, explain those. Extremistan.
Extremistan is Taleb's term for domains where huge, rare, unpredictable events like market crashes, massive price jumps have a disproportionate impact. Think fat tails in statistics, where extreme events are way more likely than standard models predict.
Got it. So the standard formulas didn't account for these big, rare events.
Nope. Standard formulas back then were mostly built on assumptions of nice, neat, normal distributions bell curves. They basically ignored these critical, high-impact possibilities. But the traders, through lived experience, they intuitively understood and priced in those risks.
Which brings us neatly to that prime example. The Black-Scholes model for option pricing. Hugely famous model, right? Nobel Prize and everything. Cornerstone of modern finance theory. Yet, Our source talks about this experience where the actual formula, with all its Greek letters and complex math, it was basically incomprehensible.
That's right. The author found that while the formula itself was like looking at hieroglyphics, simply looking at the visuals, the charts showing calls and puts, seeing the strike prices, understanding the premium prices, made the whole thing automatically clear.
Ah, so an intuitive graphical understanding completely bypassed the need for the abstract math.
Precisely. Which is why the author says he still doesn't understand. Why black skulls is taught so rigorously in universities when, in the real trading world, it's not ever used in its raw computational form by the people actually doing the trading.
It's like being given, I don't know, your shoe size, the color of your car, and what you had for lunch, and being asked to calculate your exact blood pressure.
Yeah, exactly. The model might be beautiful theoretically, under perfect conditions, but the real world is just far, far messier.
And the most glaring, catastrophic example of this gap between elegant theory and messy practice has to be the long-term capital management story, right? LTCM.
Oh, absolutely. That hedge fund in the late 90s. They famously hired some of the best brains in the world, including 2 Nobel laureates who helped develop the very models they were using.
The dream team.
You'd think. But despite all that brainpower and reliance on sophisticated math models, the fund just spectacularly imploded in 1998. Why? Unforeseen circumstances.
Which were basically those extremist-on events, the fat tails that their perfect theories just didn't handle.
Exactly. It's a huge real-world warning sign. It strongly suggests the massive limitations of purely theoretical approaches when you apply them to really complex, chaotic, nonlinear situations like global markets.
Okay, so the traders' heuristics were somehow better in practice. But how did the historical research pan out? Did they find proof?
Oh yeah, here's where it gets really interesting as the research deepened. Through meticulous digging, especially by that trader-turned-researcher Epenhog, they found proof after proof that traders had vastly, vastly more sophistication than the formula.
Not just a little bit more, but vastly more.
Right, a qualitative difference. And crucially, this sophistication came first. It preceded the formula by at least a century.
A century, wow.
Yeah. So this practical knowledge wasn't cooked up in universities and then handed down. It was passed along through what the source calls natural selection and survivorship apprenticeship to experienced practitioners.
So survival of the fittest trading methods, basically.
Pretty much. Those who developed heuristics that worked, that were robust, they survived. Those whose methods were fragile, they got wiped out by the market. Simple as that.
This historical digging really exposes this problematic cycle that the source points out, this pattern of intellectual expropriation.
Yeah, explain that cycle.
Okay, it goes like this. First, traders figure out techniques and products through hands-on experience, trial and error. Then step 2, academics, economists find formulas that basically describe what the traders are already doing successfully. Step 3, the academics then claim that traders are using these formulas, essentially taking credit for the discovery, implying theory came first. And then, step 4, new traders believe academics and their elegant theories. They apply them blindly without the underlying practical wisdom, and blow-ups happen.
Wow. So the very act of formalizing the theory and claiming it came first can actually lead to disaster down the line.
Ironically, yes, because the new guys trust the theory over the hard-won, anti-fragile practical knowledge that grew organically.
Okay, so they make this huge discovery, this clear proof that knowledge flowed from practice to theory in finance. You'd think the academic world would be thrilled, right? Ready to rewrite the textbook.
Would think, but not so fast. Their paper, the one documenting this whole inversion of knowledge, it encountered serious pushback. It apparently sat for close to 7 years before publication by an academic economics journal. 7 years.
7 years. That tells you something right there, doesn't it?
It does. But then, here's the weird part. Once it finally got published, it became one of the most downloaded papers in the history of economics. People clearly found it compelling, maybe practitioners especially.
But there's a but, isn't there?
Yeah. Paradoxically, even though everyone was downloading it, it was not cited at all by other academic papers for years, completely ignored in the formal literature.
Why? What's the theory on that?
The source puts it bluntly. Practitioners don't write, they do. Birds fly, and those who lecture them are the ones who write their stories.
Ah. So the people with the time and the protected academic jobs get to control the narrative.
Essentially, yes. History is truly written by losers with time on their hands and protected academic positions, is the quote. It implies that the story often gets shaped by those observing from a distance, not those doing the actual work.
And the most, I guess, blatant example of this fight for the narrative, this intellectual expropriation, happened when they were asked to contribute to an encyclopedia.
Exactly. The Honorable Willie Encyclopedia of Quantitative Finance. It seemed like the perfect chance to finally present their side, the practitioner's side, set the record straight historically.
But it didn't go smoothly.
Not at all. To their absolute shock, they caught the editor of the historical section, a professor from Barnard College, red-handed trying to modify our account.
Modify how?
Not just tweak it. This historian apparently proceeded to rewrite our story to play down, if not reverse its message, and change the arrow of the formation of knowledge, deliberately trying to make it look like theory-led practice after all.
Wow. That's pretty shocking.
The author calls it scientific history in the making, an academic trying to dictate, based on abstract ideas, what practitioners saw with our own eyes, overriding direct, lived experience with some preconceived theoretical logic.
And this wasn't just a one-off thing. They saw this pattern elsewhere.
Apparently so. They observed similar inversions of the formation of knowledge, like a Berkeley professor in a book attributing techniques that traders had been using since the 80s, attributing them to academic papers published later.
Making it seem like the professors invented what the traders were already doing.
Exactly. It just kept reinforcing this core, almost revolutionary idea from the source material. We don't put theories into practice, we create theories out of practice. The confusion, they argue, is widespread across many fields. The theory is the child of cure, not the opposite. The evidence is right there, but we keep falling for the old story.
And this pattern, it's not just finance, is it? You mentioned jet engines earlier.
Right. After they presented their finance paper at the London School of Economics, they found out about this professor from Rutgers, Phil Scranton. And Scranton had delivered, basically, the exact same story. But his field wasn't options trading, it was the development of the jet engine.
Okay, so what did Scranton find about jet engines?
His research showed pretty conclusively that jet engines were built and used in a completely trial-and-error experimental manner. Nobody fully understood the underlying physics at first. The original engineers, these brilliant practical minds, they just intuitively knew how to twist things to make the engine work. They tinkered, they experimented, they optimized through sheer practice.
And the theory?
The formal theory came later in a large and, the source says them somewhat cheekily, rather lame way, primarily to satisfy the intellectual bean counter.
Huh. So the opposite of what most standard histories of technology tell us, where the physics supposedly came first.
Exactly. It completely flips that script.
And this source also mentions cybernetics, debunking Norbert Wiener's role.
Yeah, citing work by David Edgerton and David Mendel. We usually credit Norbert Wiener, back in 1948, with inventing cybernetics feedback control, computing ideas. We think we owe the whole field to his mathematical genius.
But that's not the full story.
Mendel's research showed Wiener was mostly articulating ideas about feedback control and digital computing that has long been practiced in the engineering world.
The engineers, the practitioners, were already building systems with feedback loops, early digital computation. They were doing it long before Wiener wrote the book that formally defined cybernetics.
Yeah.
Yet even today, many engineers still have this illusion that Wiener invented it all from scratch. It shows how strong that theory-first narrative is.
It really does, and it extends even further back, right, to geometry and architecture. We learn geometry from Euclid's elements, all axioms and proofs. And we assume that's why we have beautiful buildings, cathedrals, that the theory enabled the building.
But the source flips that too. It argues the ancients probably got interested in geometry because they were already using the methods in building. Think about the pyramids in Egypt. They came thousands of years before Euclid formalized Greek mathematics, yet they involve incredibly sophisticated geometry, precise angles, alignment.
So the practice of building spurred the interest in formalizing the geometry they were already using.
Seems likely. And the medieval architects, the masters of work who built the great cathedrals, they relied heavily on heuristics, empirical methods, practical tools. And here's the center. For centuries, almost nobody knew any mathematics in the formal sense. According to the historian Guy Bougeon, before the 13th century, maybe no more than 5 persons in the whole of Europe knew how to perform a division.
5 people, and yet they built these colossal, geometrically complex structures.
They could somehow figure out the resistance of material without the equations we have today. They built things that are, for the most part, still standing, centuries later. There are these amazing 13th century drawings by Villard de Honnecourt. They show exactly how cathedrals were built using experimental heuristics, little tricks and rules passed down master to apprentice, not by applying theorems. It's pure hands-on knowledge.
Even the Romans admired engineers building aqueducts and everything.
They built them largely without mathematics, as we think of it. Their methods were empirical, practical. And the source even throws in this provocative idea. Maybe formal math can sometimes make people over-optimize and cut corners, causing fragility.
Like making things too theoretically perfect but brittle in reality. It mentions how new is increasingly less imperishable than the old.
Exactly. Older, empirically built things sometimes have a robustness that hyper-optimized modern designs lack. Even Vitruvius's famous manual, De Architectura, the Bible of Architects, written 300 years after Euclid, it has very little formal geometry. It doesn't even mention Euclid. It's mostly heuristics, practical wisdom. Suggests advanced math was mostly mental puzzles until the Renaissance, not a primary tool for building.
Okay, but we need to be careful here. The source isn't saying theories and academic science are useless, right?
No, absolutely not. It's not saying they're never behind technology or derived from science for their ultimate use. There's definitely what the economic historian Joel Mokyr calls an epistemic base.
Right, the epistemic base, like a big library of formal knowledge, theorems, discoveries, a sort of rule book.
Exactly, a repository that embeds all that formal knowledge, and it is used to generate more knowledge and applications. That's undeniable.
But the critical question, according to the source and the evidence, is the actual role this epistemic base has really played in the history of technology. The evidence for it being the main consistent driver theory, always coming first, often just isn't there.
Instead, what you find is this huge body of practical know-how, transmitted master to apprentice, often informally, through doing and watching. And this know-how gets underappreciated in our histories, precisely because it's so fundamental, so visible in practice, even if nobody wrote down the theory first. It's the wisdom of the doers, often silent.
The source uses a really great analogy here: cooking.
Ah, yes, cooking as a paradigm for innovation.
It calls cooking a perfect business that depends on optionality. Think about it. You're in the kitchen, you add an ingredient, you taste it. You have the option to keep it if it works, or ditch it if it doesn't. Low-cost trial and error.
Right. You benefit if it's good, limit the damage if it's bad. That's optionality. And it's like this wiki-style collaborative experimentation, right? Leading to this shared body of recipes that evolve over time. And these recipes are derived entirely without conjectures about the chemistry of taste. Nobody needed a food science PhD to invent pasta carbonara.
Exactly. There's no role for any epistemic base to generate theories out of theories in the kitchen. Like Dan O'Reilly observed, you cannot reverse engineer the taste of food from looking at the nutrition level. Knowing the calories doesn't tell you how to make it delicious.
It's all ancestral heuristics, generations of tinkering, cultural evolution of taste, and significantly, cooking schools are almost always entirely apprenticeship-based. Hands-on learning, not chemistry lectures.
No, on the totally opposite end of the spectrum, the source does acknowledge pure physics.
Right. In physics, theories are often used directly to generate new theories, leading to amazing empirical proof. The epistemic base plays a clear leading role there.
The Higgs boson is the classic modern example, right? Predicted by theory decades before they found it at CERN.
Absolutely. Entirely expected from theoretical derivations. And another incredible one is the French astronomer Leverrier back in the 19th century. He figured out the existence and exact location of Neptune just through math, based on weirdness in Uranus's orbit. Pure computation. Didn't even want to look through the telescope when they found it. He was so sure of his math.
Incredible. But the source stresses these are kind of the exceptions, right? Mostly physics and maybe other linear domains.
Exactly. Domains where errors are more predictable, from what Taleb calls mediocriston, where things average out, no single event blows up the whole system, like human height.
Not like extremistan, with its wild, unpredictable swings, like markets or technology adoption.
Right. Most complex, real-world stuff, the source argues, just doesn't behave like neat theoretical physics.
So we should use this cooking analogy, iterative, optionality-driven, to understand other fields. Do things like medicine, engineering, business resemble cooking more than physics?
That's the provocation. And often, yeah, the answer seems to be yes. Even modern medicine, despite looking very scientific, remains an apprenticeship model with some theoretical science in the background, but made to look entirely like science.
It's still fundamentally about learning from experienced doctors, seeing patients, hands-on residencies. The textbook knowledge is crucial, but the art comes from practice.
And the source suggests if medicine did move away from apprenticeship, it would go towards evidence-based methods, relying less on grand biological theories and more on cataloging what empirically works phenomenology.
Just tracking what helps patients, regardless of the underlying theory.
Kind of. It leads to that thought. Science comes and goes, and technologies remain stable. Practical applications often outlast the theories that tried to explain them initially.
Okay, this brings us to how basic science does play a role, but maybe indirectly, through unintended users or chance, like the computer.
Exactly. The computer's a great example. Basic theory, the math of combinatorics, did lead to its initial concept as a calculating machine.
But initially, nobody really knew what to do with these huge, expensive boxes full of circuit, right, beyond niche calculations or corporate databases.
Pretty much. They were clunky.
Yeah.
It was almost like they had to invent an application for the thrill of technology, not the other way around. Remember those mysterious punch cards?
Oh, yeah. Not exactly user-friendly.
Then someone had the practical idea.
Mhm.
Console, screen, keyboard. Totally changed the game. Led, kind of unexpectedly, to word processing becoming the killer app. The computer took off because of its fitness to word processing, especially with the PC boom. An emergent use, discovered through practice, not designed from theory.
And the internet. Similar story of accidental discovery.
Remarkably similar. Started as a DARPA project, right? Resilient military communication network, boosted by Reagan's Cold War spending, designed to survive a nuclear attack, basically built to be anti-fragile.
Purely military goal.
Purely military. But then you combine that network with the personal computer, and boom, what do you get?
Social networks, e-commerce, online dating.
Exactly. Social networks, broken marriages, a rise in nerdiness, the ability for a post-Soviet person with a social difficulty to find a matching spouse. All these huge societal shifts.
All thanks, weirdly, to U.S. tax dollars during Reagan's anti-Soviet crusade. Completely unintended consequences.
And crucially, at no point did academic science serve in setting its direction for these huge shifts. Computer science principles were involved, sure, but the application, the direction, was driven by chance, by tinkerers. It served as a slave to chance discovery in an opaque environment with almost no one but college dropouts and overgrown high school students along the way.
The early hackers and entrepreneurs building the web.
Right. The whole thing remained self-directed and unpredictable at every step. It evolved organically. The great fallacy is to make it sound irrational. It wasn't irrational, just not linear or planned from the top down.
The source then brings up China, drawing on Joseph Needham's work. Needham showed China's incredible historical scientific achievements, debunking Western myths.
Right. But there's a twist. As China became more of a top-down mandarinate society, very centralized and bureaucratic.
It somehow lost the zest for bricolage, that tinkering instinct.
Exactly. That hunger for trial and error. Simon Winchester's bio of Needham and work by sinologist Mark Elvin suggests the Chinese no longer had what he called the European mania for trinketing and improving. They had the knowledge, the means, to develop things like a spinning machine way earlier, but nobody tried. The focus shifted away from practical experimentation.
So it's an example of knowledge hampering optionality. Too much rigid structure stifling the very experimentation needed for breakthroughs.
That's the argument. A cautionary tale. It suggests they probably needed someone like Steve Jobs, who was, as the source puts it, blessed with an absence of college education and a rather aggressive temperament.
Huh. To just push things forward through sheer practical drive.
Yeah, that kind of uninhibited doer, driven by intuition and tinkering, not theory, is what arguably made the Industrial Revolution happen in the West.
And the Industrial Revolution itself, often painted as science-driven, but the source says it came from technologies, building tech, even hobby science.
Right. Practical solutions, not grand theories. Think about the steam engine again. A basic design existed for 2,000 years, from Hero of Alexandria.
But nobody cared about the theory.
Not really. It was the practical application, the rediscovery and refinement by people trying to solve real problems that sparked interest, not the other way around. T.S. Keeley argued the steam engine emerged from pre-existing technology and was created by uneducated and isolated men, mechanics like Newcomen and Watt.
Applying practical common sense and intuition for obvious economic reward, like pumping water out of mines.
Exactly. Utility first. And same for textile tech, the flying shuttle, the spinning jenny, major inventions by Kay and Hargreaves.
And they owed nothing to science in the academic sense.
According to the source, no. They were empirical developments based on the trial and error and experimentation of skilled craftsmen trying to boost productivity and profits, solving practical factory problems.
And historian David Edgerton pushes back on the whole idea that academic science drove prosperity back then.
He does. He notes people in the 19th, early 20th centuries weren't necessarily buying the theory-first model like we assume. And crucially, academics were mostly teachers, not researchers driving discovery until well into the 20th century. Challenges that whole narrative.
So, if not formal academia who was driving innovation back then, the source points to hobbyists and English erectors.
Yeah. These often overlooked groups, the hobbyist and the English rector, often self-funded independent thinkers working outside the system.
And they were often in pretty good situations for it, weren't they? Comfortable houses, free time.
Domestic help, tea and scones. But crucially, optionality, freedom. They could escape the publish or perish pressure of modern academia, which the source thinks produces cosmetic knowledge stuff done for metrics, not real curiosity. Their leisurely, self-directed tinkering allowed for real experimentation, failures without career suicide.
We know the famous ones like Reverend Thomas Bayes or Thomas Malthus, but Bill Bryson's book Home found way more.
Yet, apparently 10 times more vicars and clergymen, leaving recorded traces of posterity than scientists, physicists, economists, and even professional inventors combined. Astounding intellectual output from the rectories.
And the list of actual inventions and discoveries is incredible. Edmund Cartwright power loom, John Russell bred the terrier, William Buckland dinosaurs, Greenwell modern archaeology, Cambridge spiders, Garrett submarines, White naturalist, Berkeley fungi expert, Mitchell helped discover Uranus.
It's an amazing list, and probably incomplete. The source notes, organized science tends to skip what's not made here. Academia often overlooks or doesn't credit innovations from outside its walls. And maybe academics sometimes appropriated the innovation of his predecessor, folding outside discoveries into their own narratives.
There's that quote from the French medievalist Jacques Le Goff contrasting Renaissance humanists with university scholars.
Right. Le Goff believed the Renaissance spark came from independent humanists, not professional scholars. He contrasted images, the professor besieged by hurdled students in the tumult of schools, dust of classrooms.
Versus the solitary scholar sitting in the tranquility and privacy of his chambers, where thoughts can move freely, embodying order and beauty.
It captures that tension perfectly, doesn't it? The institutional academy where you are forced to think within boundaries versus the independent thinker who is free to think anything, driven by pure curiosity. And the evidence, the source argues, keeps pointing back to hobbyists in general being at the source of the Industrial Revolution. Freedom and tinkering were key.
Keeley, the scientist we mentioned, he really questioned that standard linear model. Said universities come from wealth, not the other way around.
Yeah. He argued prosperity allows societies to fund universities, not that universities automatically create prosperity. He even claimed naive interventions like government research funding could have iatrogenics, negative side effects.
Like crowding out private investment or pushing research down less productive paths. He mentioned Japan's MIT having a poor record.
Exactly. And again, the source stresses this isn't about bashing science funding itself, but about debugging causal arrows, understanding what really drives discovery, which is often messy and nonlinear.
And the biggest point, maybe the most provocative, is just the lack of solid proof for the opposite idea that theory systematically drives practice across most fields.
Right. Much of all this, the source claims, referring to that belief in the linear model, is a religious belief in the unconditional power of organized science. A powerful claim, suggesting that in America, this unconditional religious belief in organized science has sort of replaced unconditional religious belief in organized religion, a new kind of unquestioned dogma about where progress comes from.
Wow. Okay, so bringing this all together, what does this mean for you, the listener? We've dived deep into this really fascinating, maybe unsettling idea that innovation often bubbles up from the bottom, from messy hands-on practice, trial and error, tinkering, with the formal theory often coming later to explain what's already working. It really flips the script we're usually told.
Yeah, and if you think about the bigger picture, it really encourages us to value different kinds of knowledge, different kinds of intelligence, not just the academic theoretical kind. It suggests observation, practical experiments, the wisdom passed down apprentice style, the sheer drive of the uninhibited doer. These are incredibly powerful engines of progress, maybe even the main engines in complex areas.
Think about it. Ancient aqueducts, modern jets, complex financial trading, even the recipes you use every day, the evidence points towards practical ingenuity often leading the way.
Which raises a really interesting question for your own life, doesn't it? When you're learning something new or tackling a tough problem or just trying to understand the world, do you always reach for the theory first? Do you wait for the perfect map before taking a step? Or are you open to that free option of learning by doing, experimenting, iterating, letting the answers emerge from the messy process itself, even if it feels less structured?
How might this perspective change how you approach challenges, or even how you read stories about discovery? What could you find out if you allowed yourself to tinker more, to iterate, to trust your practical intuition, even before the official theory catches up? That's definitely something to mull over until our next deep dive.